Hi, everyone. I'm Stefanos Geroulanos. I'm the director of the Remarque Institute. Thank you all for coming. To those of you who are online, also thank you for joining us. And please do let us know if you can't hear or otherwise have complications here. So I'm delighted to welcome you all to this panel titled The Militarized Brain, because we couldn't find something less flashy to begin with. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is just introduce our three speakers, and then each of them is going to have roughly 15 minutes to speak, after which I'm going to open up the floor for discussion. For those of you on Zoom, please, once you join us, once you have a question, please throw it into the Q&A so that we can engage it from here, and I'll take over eventually. So first in line is Danielle Carr, immediately to my left. Danielle is an assistant professor at the Institute for Society and Genetics at UCLA. You probably know her because of her public writing, from attachment theory to Neuralink to the quote-unquote mental health crisis in the New York Times recently. Danielle has managed to somehow complete her dissertation and write a huge amount in a very non-dissertation-y, very public engagement with the status of neuroscience and psychology today. And her book project is currently titled Political Anatomies of the Cyborg. It concerns the history, anthropology, and politics of neural implants, from psychosurgery to today's deep brain stimulation. Second, we will have Andreas Killen, furthest left, who's a professor of history at the CUNY Grad Center and at City College. Andreas is the author of 3 books, each of them, I guess that doesn't work. I was going to say each of them cooler than the others, but it is actually kind of true. They're all amazing. First off was Berlin Electropolis, Shock, Nerves, and German Modernity, a book which most famously talked about telephone switchboard operators getting electrocuted and constructing an elaborate trauma and welfare state situation or trying to construct a trauma and welfare state situation to do with it. He then published 1973, Nervous Breakdown, Watergate, Warhol, and the Birth of Post-60s America. And most recently, Homo Cinematicus, Science, Motion Pictures, and the Making of Modern Germany. His talk today is part, I take it, of his forthcoming book, Nervous Systems, Brain Science in the Early Cold War, which is coming out in March. So plan ahead. And last but not least is Tamsin Shaw, Associate Professor of European Studies, European and Mediterranean Studies and Philosophy at NYU. Tamsin is the author of Nietzsche's Political Skepticism, and in the intervening years, she has also become a master of public writing, including her utter classic, The Psychologists Take Power, about psychology and torture, in the New York Review of Books, and most recently, her How Social Media Influences Our Behavior and Vice Versa, Max Fisher's The Chaos Machine, in the New York Times. Tamsin has been writing about the ethics of national security, and her own project, from which I managed to extract the title, is The Safekeepers: What is the U.S. Intelligence Community Protecting? And so with that, we're more or less ready to start. I want to thank Sam Paul and Amy Nguyen for setting this up with me. And again, welcome everybody. Danielle, the stage is echoing. Okay, the stage is no longer, the stage is still echoing. All right, give us 1 second. Oh, you think this is it? All right, have you turned off the right thing now? All right, so let's do share screen. Slideshow.
Okay, awesome. Thank you guys so much for coming. I hope at least the lunch is good, so it's worth checking out. I've been looking forward to this for a while, and thank you so much to Tamsin and Andreas and Steph, and to you guys as well. So what I want to do today is actually present some new work that comes out of my first book project, but is reaching towards my second project, which is going to be a political account of the emergence of the anti-psychiatry movement in the United States in the latter half of the 20th century. And what you're going to hear in this talk today is a story about arguably the most important brain implant initiative in the 20th century, which was the Violence Center at UCLA, which was proposed in 1972, which formed the bête noire against which the imagination of the anti-psychiatry movement was shaped, representing its sort of zenith, the worst possible case, almost like this orgiastic worst possible thing that they were delighted to protest against, and that ultimately was never built. But first, I want to just take a second to say, okay, why does this story matter, especially on a panel about the militarization of the brain sciences? I have a few axes I want to grind here today, and we'll see how many we get to. But the main one is that normally when we talk about the militarization of the sciences, at least in the history of science, we're talking about the way that military funders and their priorities, especially national security priorities, shape the way that a science develops. And there's an entire universe of scholarship, but I'm sure many people here are familiar with about what that looks like in the post-war era, whether that's in physics or the geosciences or the behavioral sciences and so on. And we could think of this as a sort of content analysis of militarization, what the science is about, what impacts the what it is of science. But what I want to think about today is how the militarization of science impacts science, not just in terms of content, but structure. And I get that this is something of a false binary, but if we can just go with it for the purpose of the rest of this paragraph. In the sense that militarization encases the scientific process and its outcomes in the way that science is shared among the community of scientists and with citizens who are supporting the scientific work with tax dollars, ultimately. It shields it with a layer of bureaucratic secrecy, control, and encases it against democratic control in a way that is not true of non-militarized science. So once we start to think about the militarization of science from this vantage of structure, this kind of encasing against a democratic input process of who gets to know about and have a say in the science, it is easier to get a handle on the militarization of science's articulation to two things. On the one hand, the commercialization and privatization of science, and on the other, the apparatuses of policing and the repressive state on the other. So briefly, on the side of the commercialization of science, it's not just that the militarization of science shapes science to military ends, but that the military funding of entities like DARPA acts as a pipeline to shepherd risky science through the dicey stage of a pipeline where it's not clear if the science is going to work out or not, and venture capital wants nothing to do with it. This is what happened with the internet. This is what's currently happening with neural engineering. This is an argument elaborated by Marina Mazzucato in a book called The Entrepreneurial State, and I'll come back to this later, but just keep this in mind for the rest of the talk. And in the articulation of the militarization of science to policing, that is, to the controlling and predicting of the behavior of a population within a territory in order to protect any given power structure, militarized science often is crafted specifically to facilitate the surveillance and technocratic apparatus that policing requires to control that population. Therefore, it makes a lot of sense that the population to be controlled is not going to have a lot of say in the production of that science that is going to ultimately result in their own oppression. So this is broadly what I would like us to keep in mind as we go through the story of the UCLA Center for the Study of Reduction of Violence. And there are a lot of points to the story, but the main one I want to highlight is that what follows is a case of the militarization of the brain being defeated. It doesn't work, which gives us a kind of counterexample to the present and shows why the reorganization of the brain sciences in the 21st century will rely so much on the militarization of public funding for the brain sciences, particularly in brain-computer interface technology. And I'll talk about that more at the end with the Brain Initiative, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with already. So here we go. In Ronald Reagan's 1973 State of the State speech given as governor of California, he extolled a new initiative at UCLA, one that would eventually be slated to receive a total of $1 million, and that's in 1973. It was a center to study the biological basis of violence and develop ways of predicting, treating, and controlling it. The mood nationally and definitely in California was already turning to law and order in the wake of open struggles against the racialized caste system of the US, like the Watts Rebellion in 1965. And there was much hand-wringing over the kind of epidemic of violence, youth violence, urban unrest, and 1,000 op-eds bloomed on the topic. And in the response, the Johnson administration had begun the Law Enforcement Administration Agency, or the LEAA, which was an agency that provided large grants to local police forces to bolster their technological capacities, normally through computerization or through militarized technologies like helicopters. So Los Angeles has always been a laboratory for testing new means of militarizing the police, and it's kind of always led the pack ahead of the nation. And the LEAA grants were immediately used beginning in the late 60s to build a high-tech police capacity, like helicopter squadrons that began terrorizing South LA. But an equally important part of this militarized upgrade of the police force was creating sophisticated computational, informational, and communicational infrastructures to better predict and control violence. Among these high-tech initiatives would be the Violence Center. Now, in the midst of all this hand-wringing about urban violence, neurophysiologists and the discipline of neuroscience had not yet really emerged. There were some organizations that called what they were doing neuroscience, but it was neurophysiologists who were kind of the hegemonic brain scientists at the time. So the neurophysiologists, seeing their chances at federal science funding disappear into the Vietnam-related cuts to the biological sciences, began casting their eye around and making new pitches for relevance and funding. Neurophysiological research using inline depth electrodes to stimulate deep structures in the brain had long been used to elicit emotional states like fear or rage in animals since the early part of the 20th century, particularly at the Harvard Medical School. And in humans since the beginning of since the mid-1950s, often in studies funded by the Office of Naval Research. In 1967, famous Harvard neurophysiologists Frank Irvin and Vernon Mark, who had been kind of key figures in the formation of this research program with depth electrodes in the human brain, published an argument in an editorial for the Journal of the American Medical Association, was a big flagship journal, that argued that widespread urban unrest, like the Watts Rebellion, could not only be explained using social factors, that wasn't enough, but in fact indicated a widespread epidemic of brain malfunction that could be treated surgically or medically. And they would expand this argument in their 1970 book, Violence in the Brain, that became kind of a crossover hit of the same sort as the bell curve or these other kind of revivals of EvoBio thinking that were happening in the early and mid 1970s. So the mastermind of the Center for the Study of Reduction of Violence, which I'm going to call CSRV for the rest of this talk, was a psychiatrist named Louis Jolyon, or Jolly West, who had closely followed the decades of neurophysiological work on brain recording and psychosurgery, and quickly recruited Frank Irvin to his new project at UCLA. This project would draw on funds from the LEAA, the California Department of Health, and the California policing budget to create a vast research program spanning from endocrinology to brain implant studies to chromosome studies to ethnological studies, trying to get a sort of synoptic interdisciplinary picture of the biological basis of violence. And I don't know if you guys can quite see this, but this is in the first version of the proposal, a list of the projects that they propose. And the idea was that not only could violence be predicted, but it could be prevented through this sort of synoptic interdisciplinary data collection. And it's important to keep in mind that quite a bit of this was specifically focused on creating computerizable data. So the idea was that this was going to be a sort of proto-algorithmic system eventually. So I don't have time to fully go into Jolly West's career here, although we can talk about it in the Q&A as much as you would like. But what you need to know is that Jolly West had been a CIA asset since at least 1952, which is when he began conducting brainwashing, hypnosis, and LSD experiments for a series of CIA studies that would become first Project Bluebird, and then Project Artichoke, and then ultimately MKUltra at the University of Oklahoma. And he keeps turning up everywhere throughout the 50s and the 60s. So for instance, if you remember, the brainwashing scare is first caused by American POWs in the Korean War who got on the radio and say, we were spraying biological weapons, which was not allowed at the time, in which the US denied. And then they all have to be diagnosed by, oh, who should it be but Jolly West, saying that they've been brainwashed. This is in fact a communist plot. Right after Jack Ruby kills Lee Harvey Oswald, who should pronounce him insane, but Jolly West, he has a long career doing LSD experiments that are tied to the CIA. So Jolly West is eventually moves to UCLA and creates the plan for this CSRB. After Reagan's State of the State address, as word spread about the Violence Center, a remarkable coalition emerged to stage some of the largest protests ever seen on the UCLA campus. And I just want to show you guys some of the flyers because it was really wonderful being in the archive and seeing the proliferation of flyers from all sorts of different organizations. So the organization that does the most on campus is obviously the UCLA chapter of Students for a Democratic Society, but this spreads all across California throughout the UC system. So this is happening at Berkeley, obviously, and the smaller UCs as well. You can see here that it begins spreading to prison organizations as well. So this is a prison union writing a legislator, West, saying that they are organizing against the center. This is my favorite one, actually. This was presented. They sort of the SDS pranked Jolly West by catching him outside and giving him this honorary membership. And if you read the bottom, it's presented by a bunch of Auschwitz doctors. The UCLA chapter of SDS, and then eventually SDS at a state level, allied with the Black Panthers, the LA chapter of now the National Organization of Women, and eventually spread to UC campuses across the state as Jolly West desperately tried to preserve the center. And this goes on for about 4 years of Jolly West just writing, different people and saying, I've put you on like an ethics panel because we've decided that we need, and they're like, what? Who are you again? And then they get mad at him. And so it's this sort of like shambolic mess as he tries to preserve the center. But from the sort of coalition, the anti-psychiatry coalition that was congealing, this is from a Berkeley periodical. There were two main critiques of the center. The first was ideological, that is, by focusing on the biologization of violence, the center was contributing to the racist framing of Black and Brown people as inherently criminal at the expense of considering structural causes of violence. And the second critique was practical, that there was every reason to believe that much of the brain implant and psychosurgery experiments would be done on Black and Brown prisoners in California. And this was not a mistaken fear. In fact, Urban and Marks had been involved in a series of experiments in psychosurgery in Massachusetts with violent sex offenders that were similar in kind to experiments being done by, for instance, Robert Heath at Tulane University, roughly contemporaneously. And crucially, this is not, the controversy was not just about psychosurgery in the sense of lobotomy. Prisoners would have electrodes planted in their brain for weeks or months at a time that would be hooked into a bank of computers, digital computers, while researchers ran vast batteries of tests to correlate behavior with brain structures. The stated rationale for all of this that let this be okay ethically was that this would allow surgeons to know precisely where to cut in the brain during psychosurgery. In reality, and neurophysiologists discussed this at their conferences at that time all the time, this was a chance for neurophysiologists to gather virtually unprecedented amounts of data about the brain's electrical activity that could be stored as computer data and correlated to behavior. It was a sort of gold mine of behavior, and this is a dynamic that continues to the present day with brain implant research. In 1972, the story had already broken about a similar test program being initiated at the prison in Vacaville. And so you can see on the, I think it's on the right there for you guys, the sort of analogy with Auschwitz in a local periodical, left periodical about this story. The protest against the violence center caused Jolly West to beat the shambolic rearguard defense. And just, there are so many lies that are really remarkable involved in this. Like, for instance, he claims that Frank Irvin had never been associated with the project, that there had never been any plans for psychosurgery or brain implant experiments, and so on and so forth. And eventually, this escalates to a state congressional hearing. The visions invoked by the movement against the center relied on tropes like Clockwork Orange. Over and over, the idea was that the state wanted to turn anyone who might threaten it into brain-controlled robots, and I think you can kind of see that with some of the flyers that I showed. Now, to me, here's the important point: that this critique that the state wanted to turn women and Black prisoners into robots was not true. It wasn't so much that the state wanted to control any particular person, as that both neurophysiologists and the state, for different reasons, wanted to use the prison population as a convenient biobank of available brains to harvest for correlations between brain activity and behavior. The state, because this would be useful in predicting violent behavior, possibly at some point, and neurophysiologists, because that's what they do scientifically. So in this sense, the democratic critique of this science was wrong. But in another sense, the ideological critique of the center was spot on, that it contributed to the biologization of violence and was an enemy of the struggle for racial freedom. Put differently, even after the CSRD plans had shifted to incorporate every critique leveraged against it, including creating ethics boards, nixing the prison experiments, and so on, the protesters were not satisfied because they were ideologically opposed to the science itself. In other words, the idea was you can give in to all of our demands about how this science is done, aka what would now be called bioethics, and we still don't want this science to happen because we don't like the coalition of police in the state that are interested in making it happen, and you can't convince us that there is a good way of doing it. So I'm going to just wrap up a little bit here because I think I'm going over, but I guess in closing, I'll point out that the debate about this was possible precisely because the funds that were going into the creation of the center were public funds. That is, they were not encased in these layers of secrecy that would be that are currently at work in, for instance, the U.S. Brain Project, which I'll just mention very briefly. There's been about $3 billion put into the Brain Project, which is modeled on the Human Genome Project to map the brain. It was a Obama initiative. And roughly half of that money has come from DARPA, the Experimental Sciences branch of the US military. DARPA is particularly interested in developing BCI, or computer brain interface programs. And the idea in much of this is that, well, we can't really tell you the citizens very much about the science. We're not really holding that many open meetings like that the NSF normally would hold, or the NIH, but we're going to sort of create these specialized panels of bioethicists, and the bioethicists will figure out what is the right way to do this science. So you don't have, there's a specialization of bioethics at work here, or what is now being called neuroethics. And the attitude is always, well, surely there is an ethical way to do this science, if only we can solve, for instance, things like the consent process. And so in closing, I want to suggest that real democratic control over science, and we need to think about the implications here, would mean saying we don't care how you do it, we just don't like this thing and we don't want it to happen. And we don't really care what you think it's for or what your ethical experts say that it's for. So I guess I'll close here with just the idea that that the militarization of science then is articulated to both commercialization and policing in a way that I've tried to show, all of which insulates it from democratic input. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Stefano, for organizing this. I'm really delighted to be here today. I'm going to talk about a slightly earlier chapter in this story that Danielle has opened up for us. So as Stefano said, I am in the process of finalizing a book on the history of brain science in the 1950s. In it, I trace several parallel lines of research into epilepsy, memory, mental illness, learning, that contributed collectively to making the brain what I call a newly explorable organ. And in many ways, this period also helped lay much of the groundwork for the late 20th century emergence of the field of neuroscience. I also look at the context in which that research took place. Mid-century brain science developed amid the circumstances that made this, as Eric Hobsbawm long ago put it, an age of extremes. And a large body of research developed during this period, examining the response of the human organism to extreme situations, to war, to concentration or POW camps, to interrogation, but also to space travel, once that began to emerge at the end of the 50s, or to automated work. That was a whole other field. So narratives about these two aspects of brain science, not always, but are often told separately. And one of the things that I try to do is bring them together and to show that while the brain became a new scientific object during this period, it also became, in part because of the circumstances of the period, a newly unstable object, or a peculiarly unstable object. So I will give a couple of examples in what follows. But let me just preface this very quickly by saying that a lot of the research that I look at reflected the influence of several schools of science. The one that I have found most important is the Pavlovian school of experimental physiology. This had really established itself in preceding decades as the kind of master discipline for study of the human organism. It offered a way to study the central nervous system, both its functions and its dysfunctions. Pavlov sometimes referred to these as, he sometimes used the language of catastrophic reactions to talk about certain kinds of breakdowns involving the nervous system. And he offered a way of studying these experimentally. So he showed, for instance, that it was possible to create experimental neuroses in his dogs. And many of the Anglo-American researchers that I look at similarly experimentalized illnesses like epilepsy, like schizophrenia, and others in an effort to make them visible in the clinical setting. So one of the people I write about is a figure named Gray Walter. He was an Anglo-American neurophysiologist based in Bristol, England. He was also a psychiatrist and a cybernetician. And one of the things that Walter showed was that it was possible, using a combination of EEG and stroboscopic lamp, to experimentally produce seizure-like activity, both in patients with epilepsy, but also in healthy subjects. He further showed that he could produce experimental neuroses in his cybernetic tortoises. So these were toy-like contraptions whose primitive design was supposed to mimic the basic properties of the brain, and which, as he demonstrated, could be made neurotic through techniques of cross-conditioning. The fact that, as Gray Walter put it, brain was now studying brain produced considerable fascination and unease, and Danielle has touched on some of the expressions of that unease, anti-psychiatry being one of the most important. Among other things, this phenomenon quite quickly opened up the possibility that brain studying brain also meant that brains could learn how to control brains, or to control minds, or to control thoughts. And Gray Walter himself felt compelled in the second edition of his book, which came out in the year 1963, to disavow these possibilities, to reject the possibility, in other words, that his field of neurophysiology could be put to such uses. But by then it was, in some sense, far too late. So that same year, 1963, the CIA, at the end of a decade-long research program, finalized its classified interrogation manual, a notorious document named KUBARK. And as this document showed, the weird, mystifying new forms of human vulnerability associated with communist brainwashing had also become, in the West, a field of experimental investigation over the preceding decade. KUBARK drew heavily on the work of several of Walter's contemporaries. One strand of this came out of the lab of the McGill neurophysiologist Donald Hebb. Hebb is now, above all, known for his theory of cell assembly and its role in learning. He played a major part in forging bridges, new bridges between psychology and biology. And he's sometimes held up as a kind of architect of cognitive neuroscience. It was also Hebb who, at the beginning of the 1950s, launched the field of investigation into sensory deprivation. In his experiments, subjects were asked to lay in so-called isolation chambers. They were equipped with vision and sound canceling devices, and EEG leads were attached to their scalps. And following their emergence from the chamber, some stayed for only a few hours, but others were able to stay for several days. He conducted tests on their intelligence. Tests seemed to show that their ability to perform on tests was somewhat impaired, although not for very long. Interestingly, he also found that many of his subjects reported experiencing hallucinations that were frequently compared to the kinds of hallucinations that Gray Walter had similarly reported on as in experiments with strobe and EEG. So these investigations soon drew the interest of the Western intelligence community. Sensory deprivation seemed to many to replicate the conditions that the West imagined POWs were being subjected to in North Korea. Hebb's findings and those of his most enthusiastic disciple, John Lilly, eventually found their way into KUBARK. And much later, that document and the techniques of isolation and sensory deprivation referred to in it resurfaced in the wake of the torture scandal in the early 2000s. Hebb's legacy subsequently became enmeshed within debates about the extent to which he contributed directly to Western techniques of torture. He has, I think, been largely exonerated of responsibility for the uses to which his research was put, although this is not true of some of his Montreal colleagues. I will come back to this in a moment, but first, I want to take a slight detour for a moment. It is perhaps not surprising, given these circumstances, that sensory deprivation has been largely written out of the history of neuroscience. I've always been very puzzled by this. Whatever the reason, sensory deprivation is simply ignored in accounts of the cognitive revolution. But a careful examination of Hebb's work, I think, shows the central importance of this research to the disciplinary transformation that he helped bring about. Specifically, it played a crucial role in his campaign to emancipate the field of psychology from the conceptual and epistemological blockages of what he called black box behaviorism. And in so doing, not incidentally, to also provide a fuller account of the many dangers facing the human organism in this new age of extremes. Among those dangers, as he argued in a lecture that he gave in 1950, shortly after arriving at McGill, were the vulnerabilities associated with the basic properties of the human nervous system itself. Well, what did he mean by that? In ways that remained, as far as Hebb was concerned, remained completely unaccounted for by standard behaviorism, the brain was an organ continually questing for new forms of stimulation, for novelty, and for mystery. And this was a trait that he went on to say that could easily be turned against the self, exploited by those skilled, for instance, in the art of propaganda or in the art of interrogation. And at this point in his lecture, he referenced George Orwell's book, recently published book, 1984, as an example of the way that people in highly controlled milieu could be made to believe quite paradoxical truths, that war is peace, for instance, or conversely, to confess to crimes that they hadn't committed. In a follow-up to his, so that was in 1950, the experiments began in 1951, and in a follow-up to those experiments, Hebb coupled sensory deprivation with selective exposure to propaganda, propaganda on paranormal phenomena. And he showed that his subjects, despite their initial skepticism to such phenomena, emerged from these chambers, expressing new interest in topics like ESP and voodoo and so forth. So Hebb, he discontinued his sensory deprivation research fairly, well, certainly by the middle of the 1950s, but in writings scattered across the rest of his career, he returned repeatedly to the findings of that research as part of a campaign to free his field from the grip of behaviorism and what he felt was its oversimplified conception of the nervous system as simply a set of mechanical connections that were only activated by external stimulation. The telephone system model was was kind of the prevailing model that he sought to demolish. This false conception of the nervous system failed to account for the brain's spontaneous activity, the fact that in the absence of external stimulation, the brain did not just fall quiescent or go blank, but rather began to experience internal phenomena, hallucination, fantasy, and in some cases, memory. By the same token, this false conception did not account for the fact the fact that the strange tricks that the brain was capable of playing on itself was a tendency that again could be exploited in ways that put the subject or that expose the subject to risk. So I'm going to now move quickly to a conclusion. Earlier, I mentioned Hebb's disciple, John Lilly. Lilly was a leading neurophysiologist based at the NIH during the 50s. Lilly, who described sensory deprivation as, quote, an experimental intervention into the complex feedback loops between inner and outer environments, replaced Hebb's chamber with a tank in order to minimize the effects of gravity on proprioception. In the drastically limited Umwelt of the tank, the experimental subject was given absolute freedom to extract what he called the maximum of information from the subjective sphere. By the same token, however, he noted, and a person, an interrogator, for instance, who could establish control over those feedback loops, could use that control to render the subject highly suggestible and perform a similar kind of extraction. So again, like Hebb's work, Lilly's found its way into Kubar. By that time, as he tells us in his autobiography, he had grown so uneasy about the potential for weaponization of his research that he had left his post at the NIH. And for those of you who know anything about Lilly, you will know that he subsequently went on to become a kind of icon of the counterculture. It is therefore perhaps somewhat ironic that it was Lilly, actually, who may have gone further than anyone else of this period in articulating a theory of the militarized brain, to use that term. In unpublished writings of the late 1950s, Lilly predicted, on the basis of his work in sensory deprivation and also on electrical brain stimulation. I think there's a not very well traced connection between his work on electrical brain stimulation and some of the things that Danielle was pointing to. He predicted, on the basis of this work, the rapid acceleration of techniques for both extracting from and injecting new information into human subjects under conditions of isolation. He speculated that neurophysiological techniques would soon exist, allowing thoughts to be controlled and then experienced as if voluntarily self-controlled, and suggested that this could lead to master-slave controls of one brain over another. In another unpublished text from this same period, Lilly conjectured that the Soviets, based on drawing upon the work of Pavlov, might actually be far ahead of the West in this field, and concluded by asking, should a Manhattan Project on mind control be established? If, as Lilly himself seemed to believe at this point, such possibilities remain futuristic, 60 years later, that seems no longer to be the case. According to the University of Pennsylvania bioethicist Jonathan Moreno, writing in the year 2006, the quote, the national security uses of neuroscience are no longer in the realm of paranoid fantasy or science fiction. Moreno goes on to say that the ethical implications of such uses urgently need to be addressed based on the fundamental principle that no one should be able to decide what goes into my brain. That seems like an excellent place to start, but we may need actually to go further than that. We may need, I think, and we can perhaps come back to this kind of reinvigorated form of critique, to invoke the title of a recent edited volume. Perhaps a form of critical neuroscience is what is necessary here. That will probably involve further resolution of the legacy of anti-psychiatry. And I am very much hoping that Danielle will provide us at least with the basis of that in her book. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Those incredibly interesting reports. I'll be talking a little bit about some overlapping issues. I wanted to start by just explaining where my interest in this comes from and why I am very worried about these questions. So we've got a scenario in which we have Russia and China both experimenting with behavioral technologies which are very sophisticated to control their own populations, but also to try to manipulate us. And of course, we also have the United States doing a great deal of research to try to get ahead of that. In the domain of behavioral science, there isn't really a difference between offensive and defensive research, just as there isn't in cyber work these days. So that really is the new frontier in warfare, and I think it's very significant. I'm not talking about today. I'm talking about the 1950s, when this problem emerged and the Americans felt that they really had to respond to China on the one hand and Russia on the other. This image is, of course, from the Manchurian Candidate. Some of you will know. So Oh, good, you guys can read some of it. So this is when the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA under William Donovan, started researching in the Army's Psychological Warfare Division some of the questions that were raised, especially by the Nazis' propaganda methods. So Leonard Doob, who was a very prominent psychologist at Yale and translated Goebbels' Principles of Propaganda in 1950, it was published in 1950, was very interested, as many others were, in that kind of work. And then after World War II, as the OSS transitioned into the CIA, a lot of people thought that it was very important to stay on a war footing in this discipline because of the Cold War, and that it was actually getting more urgent to go ahead with this work. And so, of course, we get projects like the famous MK Ultra. There's actually a new movie about this. Have you seen that it's on Amazon right now. It's just called MK Ultra. It's very sinister. But that emerged out of this World War II work into propaganda. And then in 1949, in a study for the Air Force, the Yale psychologist Irving Janis, he made this claim that the Soviets were using hypnosis, drugs, electric shock, and other means to extract false confessions, which is, of course, very like what was said about the Chinese and their brainwashing of prisoners. So the CIA's mind control problem was supposed to be the American defensive/offensive response to this. And in fact, Alan Dulles announced a brain warfare initiative that was seen as essential to national security. And the CIA conscripted many psychologists to that end. And you have to remember, psychologists who was conscripted, they weren't looking at the CIA in the way we think about it, the pre-church committee, catastrophic, inhumane version of the CIA that we see. They were thinking about this work as continuous with what the OSS was doing during the Second World War. They weren't all evil people. So a lot of very respectable scientists at Harvard and Yale and Princeton signed up to make their work relevant to these projects. Oh yeah, this was just a slide about the Chinese side of it. So after the Korean War, brainwashing became part of the American vocabulary. Not a very useful one, but it did create popular alarm about this problem, as well as alarm just among the scientific and intelligence communities. And what the aspect of this that became most famous is probably the experiments with LSD and mescaline. You can actually spell mescaline with or without an E. just pointing that out. And of course, there were really inhumane experiments done on unwitting human subjects. I actually know someone, a guy called Eric Olson, whose father, Frank Olson, was killed in mysterious circumstances, but it's thought by the CIA because he was involved in these programs, and it was said that he was taking LSD and experimenting with that, and that was an explanation for its death, but it's all very murky still.
Isn't there a documentary about that?
Yeah, Errol Morris made a documentary about it. Yeah. It doesn't really make any clear conclusions because Cy Hirsch won't divulge his sources, so understandably, I guess. But this was a very important aspect of the work. So the experiment that I want to talk about most today is Stanley Milgram's because this is his shock experiment is what I'm going to talk about. But he was part of this milieu, and his shock experiments are still very much part of the canon today. If you look at psychology textbook, they're still cited in the form that we came to know them as Milgram presented them to us in the 70s when he was promoting his own work. But originally Milgram was of course part of this milieu where they were interested in the national security uses of psychology. He conducted experiments with mescaline himself. This is that most of the stuff in the archive about this is still sealed. There are some things mostly about his applying for funding for studies on mescaline and aesthetic experience. This is, sorry, these are my really bad iPhone photos of the archive. I don't know if it's legible, but this is about looking at mescaline sulfate's impact on the learning of complex concepts from human subjects. So he was quite deep into that kind of research. And then in 1960, he applied to the Office of Naval Research and the National Science Foundation, both of which were conduits for CIA funding, saying that he wanted to do experiments that would establish a framework with which the techniques of the Red Chinese in inducing conformity could be studied. I don't actually have a slide of that picture, but when I was looking in the archive, I was quite astonished looking at his research proposal. This is the research proposal for the famous shock experiments, and they were nothing to do with what we later came to associate them with. So this is his letter from Luigi Petrullo, who was in charge of funding for the funding that the CIA put through the Office of Naval Research at the time, saying that he's very interested in Milgram's research. He might not be able to fund it in time, but he says it's an experimental analysis of obedience and action for conformity. And then he talks about some other people whose work he might be interested in. And all of that work is on coercion and obedience and how you make people conform. So this is, I take it everyone's probably familiar with with Milgram's shock experiments, but what he did in the canonical version that we know about, although there were many other that there are recordings of, was he took an actor, let's say it's Danielle, who was going to be pretending to be getting terrible shocks, and she might have said in advance that she was worried because she had a heart condition. And then there's a lab technician who invites in Andreas and says, you're going to give Danielle a shock every time she gets the answer to the question wrong, and the shocks are going to get bigger and bigger until ultimately Danielle is screaming in pain. Sorry, Danielle.
So often do.
Yeah. And the idea was to see how much you had to push people to continue giving the shocks. And in the most famous version, 65% of them went to the maximum, which was possibly killing the patient. These are very controversial experiments for lots of reasons, partly because of what it did, the trauma it caused to those poor subjects, but also just scientifically, they were not considered by other psychologists to be very rigorous. In fact, the guys that are cited in the declassified MK documents are pretty scathing about this, because they say, well, there's mixed messages, because you've got this patient screaming in pain, but you've also got this clinician who's sitting there completely impassive. So it's really not clear that there's, that it's the situation that Milgram wanted to create. So this is a picture from the experiments. And this is, can you read that? Yeah. Milgram's description of what he found in his experiments. And as you'll see, it's a description of people being put under enormous pressure, which they were if you listen to the recordings. This wasn't people just being told, oh, give them a shot, turn it up a bit, turn it up a bit. People were put under enormous psychological pressure to do this. And he is looking at their psychological and physiological responses to that pressure. So the profuse sweating, trembling, and stuttering were typical expressions of this emotional disturbance. And one expected sign of tension yet to be explained was the regular recurrence of nervous laughter. That's what he's interested in. Very much in line with the other experiments going on that were about coercing these innocent people to see if you can create some kind of action conformity, regardless of how painful this might be for them. But that's not how he described his work in public. As I mentioned, it wasn't an enormous success in the scientific community, but Milgram made a huge career out of it nonetheless, to the extent that these are probably the most famous psychological experiments that there have been. So during the time that he was doing the experiments, 1960 to 61, the Eichmann trial was going on in Jerusalem, and Hannah Arendt's commentary on it, of course, became very famous, and especially the concept of the banality of evil. And when and then he said Eichmann, when Milgram first published his research, he decided he was going to assimilate it to this model and claim that the research was exploring that same problem. So in fact, his subjects were referred to as little Eichmanns, which was profoundly offensive to them, many of whom were Jewish and had either relatives who survived the Holocaust, who were survivors. So this whole way of presenting it was very offensive to a lot of people already. So he publishes his paper in 1963 and explicitly says that he's exploring how it was that under Nazi rule, gas chambers were built, death camps were guarded, daily quotas of corpses were produced with the same efficiency as the manufacture of appliances. This is how we think about Milgram's experiments today. And the New York Times published a big article on it as soon as the paper came out. And that's exactly what they asked too. What sort of people slavishly doing what they're told would send millions of fellow humans into gas chambers or commit other such atrocities? And that's how Milgram presented his work in his book, Obedience to Authority. He spent a lot of his career writing publicly about his work and making films, that kind of thing. So my general problem with this kind of work is not just that it was misleading, but if you take psychological research that is done for these purposes to find some universal mechanism for understanding human motivations and then manipulating them, it's not going to be easily translatable into understanding real moral situations and people's actual moral psychology with none of that psychosocial context that you actually need to understand it. And so there have been a lot of criticism of Milgram if you take his work to be about why people worked in the concentration camps as guards. A lot of criticisms of that from people who are interested in what actually happened with those killings. And this is from Avram Deswan's 2015 book, The Killing Compartments, very interesting book, who says that a lot of these extermination camps were the scene of obscene savagery and gory barbarity. And on most of the killing sites, he says there was participation in a wild collective savagery, with victims being humiliated and tortured before being killed. So Arendt's account of Eichmann went a long way towards establishing the view that people were just simply following orders. They weren't these animalistic, cruel, savage people involved in the killing. They were these civilized Germans like Eichmann that listened to Bach and read Goethe. And Bettina Stangnest's biography of Eichmann really put paid to a lot of the myths about that, partly because in his notes, the Argentina papers, there was just such a vehement and ardent anti-Semitism that it showed that Eichmann had a side that was very much not just about following the orders he was given. So both of them argue that this perception of Eichmann as a functionary following orders was a deliberate fiction that was promoted by his lawyers, largely concocted by Eichmann himself. He claimed to be just a small cog in Adolf Hitler's extermination machine, and he was actually believed. So both Arendt and Milgram seem to be vindicated, when in fact, in terms of actual moral psychology and understanding what happened, we don't in fact learn very much at all. So this kind of psychological theory sought by the intelligence community and the military might not be the best means of understanding urgent moral and political questions we face. Who is hated? Who is vulnerable? Who is dangerous? And how can we resist? And I want to just finish with one, have I got time for one quick contemporary example? One of the reasons this really bugs me is that it still happens with social psychologists today. This is an article by Cass Sunstein, nothing against Cass Sunstein, but it was the 2016 Republican National Convention translated for liberals using the work of Jonathan Haidt, who has these universal moral motivations he describes, some of which are applied to liberals, like freedom and justice, and others of which are only subscribed to by conservatives, like authority and religion and purity. So he goes through with a picture of Rudy Giuliani, explaining to liberals why they don't really understand conservatives, because their real concern is about authority and purity, and we should try to understand that, when in fact just looking at that picture reminds you that that whole conference was a series of racist dog whistles, coded white supremacy, and coded messages from people like Paul Manafort to other foreign powers. And the idea of looking context-free at people's psychological motivations just seems to me to miss out on the real information that we need to be getting when we're addressed with those kind of urgent problems.